Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode, before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Hannibal Season 1, Episode 1, Aperitif. The episode in a nutshell is a short 1 to 2 lines on exactly what happens within this episode. Will is recruited by Jack to find a killer targeting young women, with Hannibal being recruited to help solve the case, but also to profile Will. And now we're going to go scene by scene in a more detailed summary and give our opinions on each part before we rank at the end. So the show opens on a crime scene, showing a bunch of FBI agents moving around, and then a pool of blood splatter, and then the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Marlowe, before we show Will standing off to the side. Will closes his eyes and the pendulum swings, erasing everything back to before the crime took place, as he assumes the role of the killer inside of his mind. Once the scene resets, he then starts moving forward as the killer, breaking down the door and shooting Mr. Marlowe, saying he shoots with surgical precision so he can die watching him take what is his away from him. And that is his design. He then moves on to Mrs. Marlowe, who is trying to use the security system, shooting her in the neck as well. Will says that the shot is expertly done and misses every artery. It's not a fatal wound, but one leaving her paralyzed. Which of course doesn't mean that she can't feel pain. She just can't do anything about it. He then presses a button on the security company's keypad before returning to the present scene and asking to see the incident report from the security company. It shows that the alarm was recorded as a false alarm, and there was another the previous week. He then informs the agents that it most likely the killer tapped their phone, which is then confirmed by a phone company worker who goes up the pole to check. Will says that he would have recorded the false alarm call the week previously and then played the recording in order to trick the security company into flagging the real incident as false. He then says that's when it gets truly horrifying for Mrs. Marlowe. Of course, this is the first time that we hear his catchphrase of "This is my design." And I do find for a show that goes really hard on the imagery, the fact that they don't really show what was done to either of these people is a bit in. So basically, the show really goes hard on the imagery a lot of the times with the murders. It doesn't shy away from being graphic at times and showing, the horror things. So it is shocking to me that in the very first scene, they didn't go hard on the horror. He just says this is where it gets truly horrifying for Mrs. Marlowe. But from what they show of the body, there was absolutely nothing really done to her aside from shooting her in the neck. So I have to wonder what it was that was so horrifying, or that he thinks is horrifying. And the fact is, usually the show, because of the nature of the show, will tell us. And in this case, it doesn't. And then it leaves you wondering and up to your imagination. Except my imagination is only so-so. So I honestly, based on what I see from the body that they show, cannot tell what exactly was truly horrifying about it other than maybe she died slow because it wasn't a fatal wound. But because they don't specify and I don't have a great imagination, I can't know. And it bothers me a little bit that they don't tell us what happens, especially because they're so willing to tell us and show us a lot of other graphic things later on down the line into the show. Will finishes a presentation on the Marlowe case to his class of FBI Academy students, saying that everyone has thought of killing someone one way or another, be it by their own hand or the hand of God, and asking them to think about Marlowe and why it was that the Marlowes deserved to die, and then also to tell them their design as their homework. As the class is walking out, Jack arrives and introduces himself, while Will avoids eye contact. Jack brings up a former disagreement over the naming of the Evil Minds Research Museum, with Will calling it Hammy. Jack comments on him hitching his horse to a teaching post, saying he knows it's difficult for him to be social. Will says he's just talking at them, not having to listen, so it isn't social. Jack then fixes his glasses, asking where he falls on the spectrum, and Will states he's closer to Asperger's and autism than narcissists and sociopaths. But then Jack confirms with him that he can empathize with the narcissists and the sociopaths, and Will corrects him that he can empathize with anyone. It's less to do with a personality disorder than an active imagination, and Jack asks if he can borrow his imagination. I feel like this scene is mostly just exposition in order to set up Will's gift and establish where his difficulties are, where he lands on the spectrum ahead of time, especially given what's going to happen in the future. I also find it a little bit weird, since Jack introduced himself, they seem to have only had minor contact in the past, know of each other, but not necessarily be close. Why Jack would be reaching forward to fix his eyeglasses? I feel that's a weird thing to do to somebody that you're not close to, or you're just officially meeting, or haven't met in a long time and aren't very close to. I feel like if somebody were to adjust glasses, like if I were to wear glasses and someone was to adjust them, and I didn't know this person, I would be a little bit weirded out. And Jack already indicates that he knows he has social difficulties. So again, if you know that he has social difficulties, why are you reaching out and why are you fixing his glasses for him? I'm pretty sure he can handle that on his own. He is an adult. While walking from the academy section into a different part of Quantico, Jack informs Will about their current case. He mentions that 8 girls have been kidnapped from 8 different Minnesota campuses in the last 8 months. Will says that he thought there were only 7, but Jack says that the 8th happened just before he walked into his lecture room. Will clarifies that they're calling them abductions, as they don't have bodies, and Jack confirms no bodies or even parts of bodies or anything coming out of bodies has been found. Will says that that means they weren't taken from where he thinks they were taken, and Jack asks where they were taken from. He says that they were just taken from somewhere else. As they enter the office, Jack goes on to say that they were taken on a Friday, so they wouldn't be reported until Monday, indicating however he's covering his tracks, he needs the whole weekend to do it. Jack and Will look at the crime scene board while Jack gives Will a picture of Elise Nichols, the most latest victim, reported after visiting her parents to house sit and feed the cat, and Will points out the other 7 will be dead as he isn't keeping them around and he's already got himself a new one. Will then makes the observation that all the girls look similar, and Jack agrees. Then Will states that it's not about all of the girls but one of them, and makes a comparison to Willy Wonka, saying that all the girls are chocolate bars, but only one is his golden ticket. Jack then asks him how they are going to find the golden ticket, and Will says that the true intended victim wouldn't be the first or the last taken, as he would want to hide how special she is. Jack then asks him to get closer to the case, but Will refuses, giving the names of other consultants and saying that they do the same thing that he does. But Jack rejects that and says that that is definitely not true, as Will has a specific way of looking at things. Will asks if there's been a lot of discussion about the way that he thinks. Jack then notes that he makes leaps that he can't explain, and Will tells him that the evidence explains. So Jack changes tracks and then says to help him find some evidence then. And Will, giving in, says that may require him to be sociable. Again, I feel like this case is pretty much exposition and setting up Will and the premise of the show. It's basically bringing Will on as a consultant, which sets up the premise, which is that Will will consult for the FBI on various cases. And then it also gives us a bit of a brief rundown and explanation on the specific case that this episode is going to focus on, and that is Elise Nichols' kidnapping and the murders of the other girls as well. Will and Jack arrive at the Nichols place in order to interview the parents of Elise Nichols, the most recent victim. Jack does the talking while Will looks around at all of the photos in the cabinets and along the walls. The parents tell Jack about Elise, indicating denial that she could be one of the victims, but Jack lets them know that she does look like the other girls. The parents then ask whether or not there's any chance that Elise could still be alive, but Jack tells them that they have no way to know. Will then interrupts from the side, asking how the cat is, saying it would have been acting weird if it hadn't been fed, but the dad says he didn't notice anything about the cat. Jack asks the parents for a moment and pulls Will aside. There, Will tells him that Elise must have arrived home because she was able to feed the cat before she was abducted. That then makes the house a crime scene. Jack calls in for forensics, specifically Beverly, Jimmy, and Brian, while the parents ask why their house is now a crime scene, and Will, ignoring the question, asks to see Elise's room. This is our first example in this scene of an intuitive leap that Will would make that other people may not notice. Most people would be more concerned about the parents and empathizing with the parents and finding Elise, whereas Will, he's over there with the cat, wondering about the cat as the clue, and that gives him the leap that he needs in order to determine that Elise came home and is already helping to move the case forward. When Will is led to Elise's room by her father, the cat is trying to get in, pawing at the bottom of the door. Will stops the dad from touching the door, which confuses him as they've been in and out all day, and Will offers to let him hold the cat if it's easier, but tells him not to touch anything. When they open the door, Elise is back in her bed, and Will needs to stop the dad from running in to her, telling him to leave, and the dad drops the cat. A little time passes, and Jack is telling Will that he's going to give him the time to empathize, saying to let them know when he's ready for them to come back in, and that no one is going to bother him. The pendulum then swings, and Will imagines himself as the killer strangling Elise. But before he gets too far, Beverly interrupts him to fangirl over an insect activity paper that he wrote, while he says she isn't supposed to be there. Before she then notes that she found antler velvet in the wounds. She asks him about his status as FBI, and he says he didn't pass the screening and is therefore only a special agent or special investigator, not an actual FBI agent. Jack comes into the room to scold Beverly, who then informs him of the velvet that she found in the wounds, while Jimmy and Brian come in and say various facts about how deer and elk pin their prey, and Will points out that antler velvet promotes healing. Jack asks Will if he thinks he was trying to heal her, and Will says he was trying to undo whatever he could, given that he'd already killed her, as whatever he had done to the others he wasn't able to do to her. Jack asks if she's the golden ticket, but Will says no, and that this is an apology, before asking if anybody has an aspirin. With this scene, I do have to wonder if the cat would mess with any evidence. I mean, as soon as the door opens, the dad lets the cat in. The cat obviously now is roaming around the room, leaving hairs, maybe messing with other evidence, maybe picking something up in its paws. Obviously, I imagine off screen that Beverly, Jimmy, or Brian will be collecting evidence from the cat since it did get loose into the room, but that's kind of a security risk on the crime scene to just walk in and then let an animal loose to go and mess with everything. This scene also introduces our forensic characters, which recur as the episodes go on and work on every case alongside Jack, Will, and Hannibal. And we also get more insight into Will as a character as we learn that he was too unstable to pass the screening in order to be an actual agent, and that is why he is just a consultant slash teacher slash special investigator. We then see Will on a plane, popping pills, presumably aspirin, and then driving home when he spots a dog along the side of the road. He approaches the dog, but at first it won't come close to him. So he leaves, and then when he returns with treats, getting the dog to come to him, and then driving the dog back to his house where he gives it a bath before he introduces it to his many other dogs and naming him Winston. We then find out that Will sleeps in the living room with all of his dogs surrounding him. And then as he's sleeping, he dreams of Elise's body, waking up in a sweat and replacing his blanket with a towel. First off, we have to comment that the dogs are adorable, and Winston especially is super cute. And we also again get more insight into Will as a character and his love of dogs. He has an entire pack of them. I also want to point out that with Hannibal, it is a series that is really, really good at the aesthetic imagery and creating the atmosphere. 90% of what I love about the show is the aesthetic of the characters, of the killings, of just all of the imagination that Will has. It's the imagery for me that really sells this series. And our first taste of that is, of course, when Will is dreaming and then he imagines the body floating next to him with all blood down her and sees the body of Elise. It's very atmospheric, very aesthetic. At what we presume to be the next day at work, Jack bangs on the door of the men's room where Will's washing his face. As Will washes his face, the water turns from clear into red. And then Jack comes in asking what he's doing in there, saying they need to talk, before shouting at another man who tries to come in and tells him to use the ladies' room. Jack then asks if Will trusts his judgment, saying they'll catch the killer easier with him in the saddle. Will tells him that he is in the saddle, he's just a bit confused on which direction it's pointing. Will then says he doesn't know this kind of killer, but Jack says he knows something, otherwise he wouldn't have said it was an apology. Will says he couldn't honor her, that the killer couldn't honor her, and therefore feels bad about killing Elise. Jack says that's not a psychopath, and then yells at Will asking what kind of crazy he is. The killer is. Will says that the killer couldn't show that he loved Elise, so he put her back where he killed her. Jack sticks on the love aspect, and Will confirms that the killer loves one of the girls, and by association has some form of love for all of the others as well. Jack then brings it back up the lack of fluid evidence, but Will says it's not that kind of love, as he wouldn't disrespect them that way. Will then starts to get more of a clearer picture, and he says that the killer kills quickly and is in his thinking with mercy. Jack then calls him a sensitive psychopath, having risked getting found to put Elise back to bed. And Will says that he will strike again, and soon, as he knows he's going to be caught, one way or the other. Again, we have to note the imagery of the water turning into blood as he's washing his face. And then we have Jack. Now, I don't dislike Jack as a character, but he's a bit forward when he's fixing Will's glasses in the earlier scene, and now he's there yelling at him. I don't know that he needed to yell at him. I feel like he could have guided Will towards giving more information, to thinking more about the killer without actually yelling at him about it. But apart from the yelling, overall, I think it was a good scene. It expands more on the profile that Will is building, and we also get the aesthetic imagery, which is what I personally love best about the show. We next have just a couple of short snippet scenes. Beverly tests Elise's clothes and finds a metal shaving from a pipe threader in one of the tears in the cloth. And then we then jump to a construction site where we see Garrett Jacob Hobbs working at a construction site while his daughter Abigail delivers him his lunch. These scenes are very short, so there's not much to say about them, but it is the first time that we do see our killer for this episode, which would be Garrett Jacob Hobbs. Jack and Alana walk between buildings, and Jack speaks to Alana, asking her to evaluate Will because Will trusts her not to play mind games with him. She says the reason that Will trusts her not to play mind games with him is because she doesn't, and she treats Will as honestly as she does any of her patients, saying that she's never been in a room alone with Will. And when Jack asks her why she's never been in a room alone with him, she tells him that it's because she wants to be his friend, and that she is his friend. Jack then says that it's a shame not to take advantage, academically speaking. Alana then puts her foot down and says he's already asked her to evaluate him, and she has said no. She also states that anything that's going to be published about will be posthumously. Alana then asks Jack what Will's biggest drive is, and Jack answers fear because of his imagination. Alana then says that fear is the price of his imagination, but Jack assures her that he won't put Will out there if he couldn't cover him. Alana then stares him down, and he corrects himself to say if he can't cover him, at least 80%. And then she says that she wouldn't put him out there. Jack then says that he needs him out there, so Alana then tells him to promise her to not let Will get too close. Now, in this scene, we kind of see the beginning of Jack kind of stooping a little bit low in order to achieve his goals. He first says that he's going to cover Will, then it's lowered. Okay, maybe I can't cover him 100%, but at least 80%. He's getting advice not to put Will out there, but he's not willing to back down on that because he knows that Will is going to be able to help him solve cases, and that's more important to him than Will's health and well-being. And we're starting to see that Jack's drive to catch criminals can maybe negatively impact those around him in this scene. All right, so now that we're in the lab again, we're with Jimmy, Beverly, and Brian as they are autopsying the body and giving a summary of the various things that they have found so far and all of the evidence that they have gathered, while Will kind of hovers off to the side. Will suggests careers that would produce the metal shavings before he imagines the body floating as antlers pierce her, while Brian then says that the antler wounds were post-mortem, so she wasn't gored, and Will then says that she was mounted on the antlers, like on hooks. They then notice that the liver was cut out before being put back, and Will comments that there was something wrong with the meat. He gets a few iffy looks from the others, but then Brian confirms that she did in fact have liver cancer. Will then makes the intuitive leap that the killer is eating them. So we know that Hannibal is a cannibal. And this is our first killer that's not Hannibal that we're meeting. And it just so happens that he's also a cannibal. And the reason that he had to put Elise back was obviously because she had cancer. And again, we see that Will is making intuitive leaps that the others missed. And we also are again getting that imagery that the show is so good at with Will imagining Elise mounted onto the antlers and the antlers coming through the floating body. Now, this scene is extremely, extremely short, but it is our first look at our second main character, Hannibal, and he is sitting in his dining room and savoring a gourmet dinner. That is it. That is our scene. We now get our proper first meeting of Hannibal officially. Hannibal is in his office in a session with Franklin, who is using a tissue while he cries about being neurotic before putting the used tissue over on a table. Hannibal side-eyes the used tissue on the side table, and Hannibal says that if he wasn't neurotic, he'd be something far worse, before explaining how the body is designed for short bursts of anxiety and not the constant anxiety that Franklin experiences. He explains that that is why Franklin feels as though a lion were on the verge of devouring him all the time, every day. He then counsels Franklin that he needs to convince himself that the lion isn't in the room, because when it is, he assures him that he will know. Hannibal then sees Franklin out at the end of their session and finds Jack waiting there. Jack first greets Franklin, mistaking him for Hannibal, before Hannibal then says that it's a private exit for his patients, and Jack corrects himself before introducing himself as FBI, asking if they can talk. Hannibal sends Franklin away, telling Jack that he'll need to wait. Jack then waits in the waiting room until Hannibal comes back, before Hannibal invites him into his office. Jack then, in an effort to be polite, confirms with Hannibal that there's no other patients waiting, and Hannibal indeed confirms that they are alone and that he has seen all of his patients for that day. Jack then makes some small talk, pointing out some of Hannibal's drawings, trying to get him to know him a little bit, looking around the office. Hannibal sneakily picks up a scalpel, mentioning how sharpening a pencil with one gives a sharper point as a way to say why his drawings are so detailed and so well done. He then comments that he suspects Jack is investigating him, which Jack laughs off, saying that he was referred by Alana Bloom. So Hannibal puts down the scalpel, and they then discuss Alana for a time as a mutual acquaintance, before Jack mentions that she showed him a paper on social exclusion that Hannibal had wrote, which he found to be very interesting, before asking Hannibal to help him with a psychological profile. Now this, of course, is our first scene where we're properly introduced to Hannibal. I like how he makes the FBI wait in the waiting room until he is done and he is ready. Usually, if law enforcement were to come to your door, you would be tripping over yourself to make sure that they are happy so that nothing bad happens to you. But Hannibal, with all of the confidence that he exudes, has Jack wait. And then we immediately realize that Hannibal is dangerous. He subtly picks up that scalpel, and we know that if Jack had said he was investigating him, that would have been the end of Jack. He armed himself very discreetly under the excuse of sharpening a pencil. And then once he realized that he wasn't being investigated and that they were actually there for his help, then he just gently puts that scalpel down. But I love how we're being subtly warned and hinted that Hannibal's a dangerous person. Hannibal has now joined Jack and Will in the office with the crime board, and Hannibal is looking at the crime board with Will and Jack while Jack is telling them about Freddie Lowndes posting a photo of Elisa's body on Tattlecrime, which has led to an influx of confessions. Will calls it tasteless, and Hannibal asks if he has trouble with taste, and Will says that his thoughts are often not tasty. Hannibal agrees, saying that he has no effective barriers. Will then tells him that he builds forts. Hannibal comments on Will not making eye contact, and Will says that eyes are a distraction because they show too much, and you see too much, and you don't see enough. Hannibal then says what he sees and learns touches everything else in his mind. His values and decency are there, but shocked at his associations and appalled at his dreams. No forts for things he loves. Will becomes agitated, asking whose profile Hannibal is working on. He turns to Jack and asks the same, whose profile is Hannibal working on? Hannibal then apologizes, saying that observing is what he does, and he can't shut it off any more than Will can shut off his imagination. Will comes back with a "don't psychoanalyze me, you won't like me when I'm psychoanalyzed," before making his escape quickly, saying that he has to go give a lecture on psychoanalyzing. Once Will's gone, Jack then turns to Hannibal, saying that they should take a less direct approach to Will's profile, as Will doesn't like being psychoanalyzed, as he said. Hannibal then gives his preliminary observations about Will, having pure empathy, and how that is an uncomfortable gift, but he thinks that he can help Will find the killer. I do like how we immediately see the kind of back and forth banter between Will and Hannibal that kind of defines the relationship throughout the series. And while everyone may not find it funny, I personally found the you won't like me when I'm psychoanalyzed, and now I have to go give a lecture on psychoanalyzing to be very amusing. I like that line. It's one of my favorites in the series. It's one of the ones that I actually remember quite often as being quoted, and it's also a conversation that is used very frequently in fan fiction. If you read a fan fiction and Will and Hannibal are the main characters of that fan fiction, guaranteed this conversation is going to be in that fan fiction. We now find ourselves in a field seemingly in the middle of nowhere, while a girl named Cassie Boyle is mounted on a stolen stag head, while carrion birds feed on her. Jack also mentions that the killer has gotten a nickname, which is the Minnesota Shrike. The stag head was reported stolen the night before and was taken from about a mile from the field where they are in. Jimmy gives facts about the shrike's hunting habits, saying that it's a type of bird that impales its prey on thorny branches or barbed wire, rips their organs out before hiding their prey in order to eat them later. Will then observes that it's petulant, almost like the killer is mocking either Cassie or them. Jack asks where his love went, but Will informs him that it's not the same killer, that this killer is a copycat. Brian then points out that the lungs were taken while she was still alive. We then move over to Hannibal in a nice chef's outfit, preparing lungs for cooking. Will then confirms that the copycat is the copycat because Elisa's killer had love and wanted to consume his victims to keep part of them inside, whereas the copycat wants to destroy them and thought that she was nothing more than a pig, going further to say that the original had a place for killing, not a field, saying he likely has 2 houses or a cabin that would have an antler room. Hannibal then is shown frying up chopped lungs in a pan. Will then also is able to further develop his profile, saying that the golden ticket will be his daughter, who's leaving home soon and that he can't bear to part with, saying that he's killing the girls that look like her so that he doesn't have to actually kill her. Jack asks about the copycat, and Will profiles him as an intelligent psychopath and sadist, and he says he'll be very hard to catch, as there's no motive and there's no patterns, saying that it's possible he may never kill that way again. Then he tells Jack to have Hannibal profile him, as he's so impressed with his opinion, before walking away. Hannibal enjoys dinner with a smirk on his face. Again, and this is probably going to be a running theme throughout this entire rewatch, but the imagery is again fantastic. The stag head, the body mounted on the stag head, all of the carrion birds flying around, pecking at the body, pecking around on the dirt around the body. It's an incredible image, and it really sticks with you. Most of the crimes in this show, they stick with you. They stick in your mind, and they're very aesthetically done. And this one is, of course, no different. I also love Will's barb at Jack at the end. Since he's so impressed with Hannibal's opinion, he should just go and ask him to profile them, because he is sure that Hannibal was profiling him, even though both him and Jack were denying it. And then I also love how in this scene, Hannibal cooking the lungs is interspersed so that we as the audience, even though Will and Jack don't know it yet, we as the audience are well aware that Hannibal is a cannibal and he is eating Cassie Boyle's lungs. We now have Will in the shower, and as he showers, the curtains open to show a stag looking at him. And then there is knocking, and then the knocking turns out to be Hannibal at the door asking if he can come in. Will asks where Jack is, but Hannibal tells him that he is in court, so it's just going to be them today. Hannibal then brings out multiple containers of food and various dishes for him and Will, telling Will how particular he is about his diet. He then prepares most of his food himself, explaining that the food is a protein scramble with eggs and sausage. Will thanks him before Hannibal then continues, apologizing for ambushing him and saying that he'll soon need to apologize again, so he'll use his apologies sparingly going forward. Will tells him to keep professional, but then Hannibal suggests that rather than being professional, maybe they should just socialize like adults, because God forbid they become friendly. To which Will replies that he doesn't find him that interesting. Hannibal kind of looks at him for a moment, and then he says, "You will." He then changes the subject back to the case, and Will brings up his copycat theory. Hannibal asks what gave it away, and Will says that everything gave it away, saying that the scene was practically gift wrapped like a negative film to show him the positive. Hannibal then asks if Will ever has any problems, and Will says no. And Hannibal says, of course he doesn't, because they are just alike, problem free. Before he then comments that Jack sees Will as a fragile little teacup, used only for special guests. This makes Will laugh, and then Will asks him how he sees him. Hannibal says that he sees him as the mongoose I want under the house when the snakes slither by. Will doesn't say anything to this, but he does look at him a little bit confused. Again, I want to point out this back and forth between Will and Hannibal, their conversations dynamic, all of the lines that they're passing back and forth. I like these two characters. I like how well they get along right from the start. I like that they are the two main characters that we focus on. I also like that Hannibal is starting now to establish himself kind of as Will's sounding board, guiding him to work out his thoughts, and this is a theme that we are going to see continue throughout the series. Will and Hannibal visit a construction site together, and as they pull in, Will asks why Hannibal is smiling. And Hannibal says that he's just curious about how the FBI goes about its business. And Will tells him that they will be visiting many construction sites where the metal shaving may have originated to see if they can find anything in particular. We then see them inside of the building on the construction site, where a woman working in the site's office is gossiping about their presence to an unknown party over the phone. And then Will asks her about Garrett while he's looking through the resignation letters that the union requires after a job finishes. He then asks the woman if Garrett has a daughter, but she says she doesn't keep up with those people, so she wouldn't know. Hannibal then asks Will why Garrett Jacob Hobbs is standing out so much, and Will says that he only left a phone number but no address, when all of the others had left addresses. Hannibal says, therefore he has something to hide. Will then asks the woman if she has an address for Garrett Jacob Hobbs, and then she helps them to load up the files into their car, but one of the file boxes ends up falling, and so Will stays outside to help pick it up while she continues to move boxes over to the car. Hannibal takes advantage of this and goes back inside, and he calls Garrett Jacob Hobbs' number using tissues to avoid leaving any fingerprints. The Hobbs family is all in the kitchen making breakfast together when the phone rings. Abigail is the one who answers before passing the phone to her dad, who asks who it is, but she tells him that the number is blocked and the person on the other line didn't say. When Garrett Jacob Hobbs takes the phone, Hannibal then informs him that he is making a courtesy call and then asks if he's listening. Once he confirms that Garrett is listening, he then says they know before hanging up. In this scene, they obviously have tracked down the killer, though they aren't 100% sure of it yet. They have a pretty good idea that Garrett Jacob Hobbs is their main and first suspect. And then Hannibal, as a fellow serial killer, decides to let him know, give him warning that they are on their way. But while I was watching it, I did have to wonder, Will isn't technically an FBI agent. Hannibal certainly is not an FBI agent, as neither one of them are official agents. Is it legal for them to be acting on their own, going through the investigation? Obviously, now that Garrett is a suspect, they're going to go over to his house. But are they even able to arrest him because they're not official agents? One is profiling the special agent, and then the other one is a teacher slash special agent. And I don't know the full breadth of what special agent means, whether it means he can make arrests or whether it just means that he also consults on the case, but then it has to be an agent who actually does the questioning and the arresting. But I do find it odd that Jack isn't there and that it's Will and Hannibal acting on their own since neither one of them are officially FBI agents. We now fast forward in time to Will standing outside of Garrett Jacob Hobbs' house covered in blood splatter. We then see the pendulum swing and time reverse to when Will and Hannibal first arrive. Will gets out of the car first while Hannibal sits inside and takes his time getting out. Then we can hear Mrs. Hobbs, and she's making sounds of distress, and Will rushes forward to the porch where she's lying with her throat slit. Will tries to stop the bleeding while Hannibal watches, but fails completely as his hands are shaking and he's not able to apply any sort of pressure to the wound. Will then, once she has passed, gets out his gun and heads towards the kitchen while calling out that that they are FBI. When he reaches the kitchen, he then sees Garrett holding Abigail before he slits her throat too. Will then shoots Garrett 10 times before running to Abigail and kneeling down to try to stop the bleeding. He then glances towards Garrett while he is failing to apply any sort of pressure to the wound, who keeps telling him and repeating to him, "See? See?" Hannibal comes in then, and after a short time observing, calmly walks over and takes over putting proper pressure on the wound, while Will is there shaking like a leaf. Abigail is then brought out by the paramedics with Hannibal following, and Hannibal gets into the ambulance after Abigail while Will leans on his car in a daze. Now, I don't know if this is a Will thing or an FBI thing, if it was just that Will was too filled with adrenaline to remember any sort of training, or if he's just never had any sort of first aid training. But with Mrs. Hobbs, we see that he can't put pressure. Like he's holding onto the neck, but he keeps lifting his hands up. His hands are shaking. He's not putting any pressure on the wound whatsoever. And then he does the same thing with Abigail. And for his own motivations, for his own reasons, Hannibal decides to let Abigail live, sorry. And so then he applies the proper pressure, and as he was formerly a surgeon, he is able to put enough pressure on to stop the bleeding or her from bleeding out so that when the paramedics arrive, they can then take her to the hospital and save her life. But it's just, I have to wonder, like, I would think in basic training that there would be some sort of first aid training on how to properly apply pressure to the wounds. Maybe they would have a first aid kit in the car, not that they would have had time to go and grab it in this particular case. But I just feel like Will was entirely inept at trying to stop the bleeding on either Mrs. Hobbs or Abigail, and Abigail is just lucky that Hannibal took some sort of liking to her or saw her as a tool that he could use and decided that he was going to step in and save her, because throughout the entire scene, he just stands back to observe Will and his reaction to the scenario that is unfolding without taking any sort of action until that last moment when he saves Abigail. We now are wrapping up the episode, and we see Jack enter a lecture hall looking for Will, but finding that Alana is actually the one presenting his class. When Jack asks where Will is, she tells him that he promised he wouldn't let him get too close before returning to teaching. We then return to where Will is, and we see that Will is walking through the hospital to Abigail's room, where he finds Hannibal asleep in a chair next to her bed, holding her hand, and he takes the second chair on her other side. Again, as I mentioned at the start, this is our last scene of the episode, and it's just wrapping it up. And Hannibal is presenting himself as a caring individual holding Abigail's hand, holding vigil by her bedside, and Will as sort of becoming a surrogate of sorts, decides to take the seat on the other side and also hold vigil over Abigail alongside Hannibal. And so now that we have rewatched the episode, it is time for my favorite part, which is the ranking section. On this channel, I rank under two lists, the mostly objective list and my personal list. My personal list is, of course, based on my emotion and my own entertainment and opinions on the episode. And then the mostly objective list is mostly objective. The reason it is not completely objective is that my bias and judgment do apply, but emotion is removed from the equation, and that is what makes it mostly objective. Okay, so I'm going to spoil it for you. This episode, under our mostly objective ranking values, is going to be a 10 out of 10 episode. The main reason for that is that we are introduced to a lot of characters within this episode. We have our multi-episode supporting character in Garrett Jacob Hobbs, whose ghost does reoccur. We then have multi-season supporting characters in Abigail, Beverly, Brian, Jimmy, Alana, and Jack. And then we, of course, have our multi-season main characters, which are Will and Hannibal. The first episode also establishes the premise of the show, that Will is a special consultant who uses his empathy disorder in order to help the FBI solve crimes, and Hannibal consults and is his sounding board, his guiding post, so on and so forth. We also have some world building in that we learn more about FBI procedures and how those are working in this fictional universe. And all of these things are positive. So our world building, our main character introductions, those are all worth 4 points each, which obviously already we're over 10. Then we have the premise establishment and our multi-season supporting character introductions, which are all worth 3 points. And then our multi-episode supporting character in Garrett, which is worth 2 points. So with all of these points, we're well above 10. There's literally no way that it's ever going to be below 10, and 10 is our maximum score. So this is an episode that's 10 out of 10. However, I do want to state one negative, and that is that I don't see the need for Abigail as a character. In this episode, in future episodes, I simply don't understand why Abigail recurred, why she was saved. I don't think she adds anything to the series. I don't really like her as a character. I don't hate her as a character, but I don't see her as a necessary character, and I feel like the show still could have been amazing even if she had died. Like, she's not integral to it, though they do tend to, especially in the first few episodes, treat her like she is integral. But I find that she's a very weak character. She's not got a lot of personality or meaning or anything like that behind her. And so for that negative, it is a -4. But even with that -4, we're still well above 10. So still a 10 out of 10 episode. All right, so because it is the first episode, we only have one episode on our list, and that is Aperitif. So it is in first place on both the mostly objective ranking and my personal ranking. For my personal ranking, I gave it a 7 out of 10. The reason is that I believe that there are other episodes that are much stronger than this one. This episode had a lot of exposition. It was introducing a lot of characters. It had amazing imagery and very memorable imagery, even as compared to later on in the series. So it was a very good episode. But I know that there are ones that are going to be better. And of course, like I said, there's Garrett recurs, and I don't understand why he would need to. I feel like they could have still done the show without that needing to be a thing. Same with Abigail. I think she's a weak character. So those characters that they're introducing in this episode and that are going to recur into future episodes, because I feel like they're kind of unnecessary, I do think that is a negative. So 7 out of 10 to me seems fair. And for our last ranking, we are going to be looking at the series ranking so far. So in the series ranking, we're ranking each season against each other. So we won't know what the final result is until we have finished the entire series. But for now, we're going to add today's score to our total. In season 1, there are 13 episodes, which means that they can score a maximum score of 130 points. In this case, for the first episode, our mostly objective score was 10, so it's now 10 out of 130. And for the personal score, I've ranked it 7, and so that's 7 out of 130. Once we finish the season, we're then going to find the percentage score for that season, and then once we have watched all of the seasons, those with the higher percentages are going to be considered the better seasons, and we'll find out which seasons are better. And with that, we have now rewatched and ranked Hannibal Season 1, Episode 1, Aperitif. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.